always something like, okay, are we on? Okay, this is Maya. Ready? Yeah, hang on, just give me a minute. Give me a minute here. Yeah, we can turn it on now. Okay.
Well, it's my real pleasure to have you all here tonight to meet Randy Biederman, whom I knew a little bit about, but I met her in person tonight, and she's a wonderful person. So I'm happy to bring her to you. Right, no, so the book, it really, it's a remarkable achievement. I was speaking at dinner with Randy and telling her over the years, I've seen many films, I've read many books about the Holocaust or related to the Holocaust, and this one is different. I mean, it is Holocaust related in the sense that the author, Mark, and co-author, his wife, Randy, did not experience it directly. But earlier today, there were a group of us who met this morning, and we were talking about generational trauma and and definitely Mark's story is one of a child of Holocaust survivors and generational succession. So, but I'm going to let Randy tell you about all that. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Mark and a little bit about Randy. Mark was born in Detroit, raised in Michigan, a student and graduate and a veterinary graduate of Michigan State University. Go Dr. Biederman, go Spartans. Yes. And he worked here when Windsor had a racetrack. And I wasn't a racetrack, but whenever my brother-in-law came, my brother was a real horse guy. So it was a very lucrative industry for a while, and then the government of Ontario decided to back away from it. And that's when Mark and his wife, Randy, left Windsor, but they've had much experience here. And Mark spent his last days in California working as a veterinarian and had a very untimely death at age 59, a real loss to horses, a loss to people who loved horses, but most of all, a loss to Randy. And I think it's a wonderful thing that she is honoring him and continuing his legacy by speaking to groups like us. So we're lucky tonight, too. And Randy was born in Toronto and grew up there, but she has her undergraduate degrees from the University of New Mexico. So it's New Mexico State, excuse me, right. It's a strange world. But then she met her Bashert here in Windsor. One night at a friend's party, in comes this tall, really tall. I mean, if you met Mark, he was a big guy. And the rest, as they say, is history. And they had a beautiful marriage. And Randy accompanied Mark in his travels to Europe to research what he was going to do. And she assisted in the writing of the book. So it truly is, as the book says, Mark Biederman with Randy Biederman, and they had a life together, they wrote a book together, and tonight she is here to be with us and share the story, and I'm looking forward to knowing more. I read the book. It's a really interesting book, and I'm looking forward to seeing more. Randy, come on up. Yeah, turn the mic over to you.
All righty. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Stuart. That was very kind.
Right, I'm not paid by the minute.
Oh, the word. Am I paid by the word?
Yeah.
So anyway, I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. This is obviously a really personal story for me, but it's actually, for what's going on in the world right now, also a very timely worldwide story. Does everybody know that it is Yom HaShoah? Yeah, okay, good. For those of you who don't know, this is the Yom HaShoah is Holocaust Memorial Day. And my cousin called me from Israel yesterday morning and said, this is a big deal here. And I said, it's a big deal here too, depending on who you are. So anyway, thank you. Thank you for taking some time out of your evening to come and hear my story. And watch the screen. That is it. That is the book. Here it is. This is what got me invited here tonight. And I was fortunate enough, I used to live in the area. I spent many years in Windsor. Actually, much of my childhood was here, and all of my adult working years were here. But Mark and I left 11 years ago, and this is my first time back. And for me, this is a huge deal because between Mark and I, when he was still alive, we spoke across North America. I mean, I was so fortunate to get, I was flying to New York, going to Pennsylvania, going to Arizona. I was all over the place speaking. And the one thing that I wanted to do desperately was bring this story home. This is home. And fortunately, I got contacted for, as part of the Yom HaShoah services yesterday at Temple Kolami in West Bloomfield. They invited me and they said, hey, we'll sponsor you to come out. And I'm like, okay, if I come out, I want a week here. And I was talking to Maria and I said, I'm going to be in town. Maria, pull it together. Find me a venue where I can speak in Windsor and bring this story home. So I'm bringing the story home and I'm grateful to be here. So thank you, all of you, for really supporting my dream to be back here. So anyway, getting into the story, both of Mark's parents were Polish Holocaust survivors. He knew that, but there was a lot he didn't know. In fact, there was pretty much everything that he didn't know. He was born in Detroit. His parents were like pretty much the only people in their families to have survived. They survived, spent some time in a displaced persons camp in Linz, Austria, and then worked their way to the United States and ended up ultimately in Detroit because there were employment opportunities there. They settled in Oak Park, and that was where Mark grew up. And he became very early aware of the fact that his parents were very different than the other parents in the community. First off, they had accents, which in Oak Park in the early 1960s was pretty rare. And second off, he'd go to friends' birthday parties. He said he started noticing this when he was about 6 years old. He'd go to the birthday parties, and he'd be looking around, and it's like, wow, there's grandparents, there's aunts, there's uncles, there's cousins. Why don't I have any of that? And he'd go home and he'd ask his mother, like, Mom, how come I don't have any of these family members like my friends do? And she said, oh, they were all killed during the war, which is a pretty heavy thing to drop on a 6-year-old. And then he tried to ask more questions, and it was like, oh, nope, we're done now. They're killed, it's done. And he spent much of his early childhood trying to put the pieces together, like, why was all my family killed? And of course, his parents wouldn't talk about it. And every time he tried to press them, they were like, you're too young to hear this. We'll talk about it when you're older. And let's take a, there are Mark's parents. And this is this was a picture taken during Mark's bar mitzvah. And in Poland, they were Hersh and Salomea. They immigrated to the United States. They became Harry and Sally. Yes. My own personal, when Harry met Sally. And they were a huge love match, which is rare in Holocaust marriages. You know, they survived the most horrible of horrible. And many couples just, found each other and said, well, you got nobody, I got nobody, let's just get together. build a family. So there were a lot of very unhappy Holocaust marriages. They were mercifully very happy. Sadly, though, looking at this picture, Mark's dad looks like the picture of health. Within 6 years, he was dead. He got pancreatic cancer and got very sick very quickly. And then suddenly, he was gone. So that promise of, we're going to talk about this when you're older, he always held that, okay, one day my dad's going to sit and tell me what happened in Europe, how he lived, what his life was like, what made it possible for him to survive. And suddenly his dad's dead, and all of his stories, his history, his secrets, everything died with him. And Mark was haunted by that. And, what's the resolution when you know nothing? But one of the things he did know, there was one thing that his dad did talk about, ever so briefly, but tied to this coin. You're looking at that and you're saying, a United States Mercury head dime, what does that have to do with a Holocaust story? Let me explain. Okay, when Mark was about 9, he went grocery shopping with his mom. And they picked the groceries, went through the checkout line, and this is back in the old days when you paid with cash. And I'm looking at the audience, I'm thinking most of you probably remember those days. Yeah, so she paid with cash, and she got some coins back, and she gave Mark a handful of coins because he'd been a good boy in the grocery store and didn't carry on. So here's your coins, you've been a good boy. And he's looking at his coins, and he finds this really old dime. And these things went out of circulation in the U.S. in 1945. So this was a big deal. He's like, wow, Mom, look, I got this great coin. I'm going to start a coin collection. I can't wait to get home and tell Dad about this. So they drive back to the house. She's unloading her groceries. Little Marky's running in the house like, Dad, look. I got a really old coin. I'm going to start a coin collection. And something about the exuberance of his young son with his excitement over this coin must have triggered something in Harry, and he looked at his boy and he said, my family had a coin collection back in Poland. We buried it in the yard just before we were deported by the Nazis. And that was pretty much the only thing that Harry ever told Mark about his past. So Mark kind of buries this in the recesses of his young mind and says, wow, there's coins somewhere buried in Poland. I should be able to find those, right? It's not a big country, is it? So anyway, life went on. Harry died. Mark went off to Michigan State. He did his undergrad in animal science and then went to vet school there. And when he was in his second year of vet school, his mom called him up in Lansing and said, you know what? I've had enough of living in the house. It's too big, too much to take care of, too many memories. I want to move. And he said, you know what? You're right. You should get a condo and kind of alleviate some of your responsibilities. So he said, I'm going to come home this weekend. I'll bring some boxes. We'll start cleaning up the house for sale. So Mark, comes. He's doing some cleaning, goes into his dad's nightstand, which hasn't been touched since he died. And he opens the dad's nightstand, and lo and behold, there's these old pictures, which he'd never seen. And he says to his mother, who are these people? Why does Dad have these? And she's like, oh, that's your dad's mother and 2 of his sisters. And Mark was like, Dad had sisters? I mean, that was the level of non-communication in this family that he was not even aware of the fact that his dad had sisters. I mean, can you imagine that? Dad had sisters. How many sisters? He had 3. Here's another picture of, and this is Mark's dad holding the ball with his sister. But Mark knew nothing about it. So here he is, little Harry, little Hersh at that time, with his sister. He was probably about 3 years old here, and none of them could have had any idea what would have been in store for them in the next 10 years. 10 years from this picture is when the Nazis marched into Poland. And here are all three of the Biederman sisters. So Mark's like looking at these pictures and going through them saying, Mom, what do you know about these girls? Oh, they were killed during the war. Do you know their names? No. What do you know? She said, I don't know anything about your dad's family. So the secrecy that the Holocaust survivors had with their kids also translated into their spouses. You know, here she was married to this man all these years, and she had no idea what his sisters' names were or anything really about them other than they were killed. It's like, okay. So Mark's like, I got to find out about these girls. I mean, who's lighting a yurtzeit candle for them? Nobody, obviously. So he said, I'm going to sit you down, Mom, and we're going to talk, and I'm going to know everything about your history. And he did get her to disclose a fair amount of her history, not everything. That kind of, it came in dribs and drabs over the years. However, he said, okay, now I want to know everything you know about Dad. She said, well, in Poland, his name was Biederman. He had 3 sisters, had mother and father, and he was from Krosno, Poland. And he's like, that's it? That's what you know? And she said, yep, that's what I know. So here's Poland. As you can see, there's a lot of cities. There's a lot of space to cover here. And Krosno is right here, very far southeast corner. And you can't really tell from this map, but it's not a big city. It's more like a little provincial outpost, kind of like maybe visiting Harrow or something. You know, it's small. So, but anyway, he's got a name. He's my dad's from Krosno. Okay, great. So Mark's mom, of course, fluent in Polish. He presses her into service, and he said, okay, Mom, we're going to start writing to the Polish authorities, and I'm going to find out everything about Dad and his parents, and I'm going to find out about the 3 girls. So she was like, oh, she would have rather have done anything than write to the Poles. But love of son, she sat down and wrote the letters, and Mark dutifully mailed them off to Poland. However, this was like about 1984, and Poland was entrenched behind the Iron Curtain. It was firmly a satellite of the Soviet Union. There really wasn't a free flow of information. And, you know, these people were getting letters in the Krosno City Hall, Vital Records Office, et cetera, and they're looking at these thinking, how much trouble do I want to go through for some American kid? And he never got any answers. And he tried some other stuff, Polish Embassy, Red Cross, etc. You know, any of the normal places that you would try and get information about Holocaust survivors, and he just never had any success. And so life went on. He graduated from vet school, and then he went to Colorado State to specialize in equine surgery. And then he came back to the Detroit area and met me. And he tells me this story about his family. And I'm like, well, so what have you done? He says, well, I've written a bunch of letters. I've done some other stuff. I've stepped into the, I stopped in at the Polish consulate, etc. And he said, I've got nothing. And by this time, the Iron Curtain had fallen. So I said, what do you think about going to Poland? Yeah, my brilliant idea. Okay, it's me, honey. I love you. Let's go to Poland. Because I figured, okay, we get to Poland. It's a whole lot different than sending a bunch of letters and them going, whoosh. I figured we're going to get to Poland. You're going to be face-to-face with folks saying, I'd like to get some records on my family. And, you know, how can they refuse you? Boy, was I naive. Really, I was naive. So anyway, he took my advice. We went to Poland. Off we went, and we used a travel agent. It was somebody actually in town whom I knew, named Rita Ossington. And I called her up and I said, Rita, Mark and I are going to Poland. And she said, whatever for? Because at that time, I know there are a lot of groups that go down to Poland, but we were undertaking this ourselves. Very soon after the curtain had fallen, Poland was kind of a mess, trying to pull itself back from the brink of being the Soviet satellite state. It was a mess, actually. And she had a measure of reluctance of sending us there, but I'm like, hey, you know, Mark wants to do this genealogy research. And she said, okay, give me a couple days to work on this, I'll get back to you. And her suggestion was, when she got back to us, is fly Detroit to Frankfurt, in Frankfurt, pick up a car rental, and then just drive to Poland. I mean, there weren't even like reasonably regularly scheduled flights in. So I thought, okay, we'll drive. The naivety of youth. So here we go. We head off. We get to Frankfurt, go to the car rental kiosk, and they give us the keys. We go to find the car, and it was like this horrible, I think it was a Trabant, if anyone knows what those are. It's like a 2-stroke engine. I mean, we're in Germany. We're in Germany proper. I'm thinking we're getting a Mercedes, we're getting a BMW, we're getting an Audi. We got a Trabant. And I think that when we went to the gas station, I think we had to mix gas and oil. You know, like your lawnmower. So anyway, I go back in and I said, there must be a mistake here. I think you've given us the wrong car. My friend booked this, and she wouldn't have done this to me. And they said, our information is that you're going into Poland. And it was like, yeah? I said, Poland's pretty lawless right now. And I'm like, really? What am I getting into? And they said, yeah, we're not sending a good car into Poland because it'll get stolen immediately. So I'm like, oh, geez, okay. So we head off in this little car, and we're on the Autobahn heading towards Nuremberg, and everybody's just flying past us. And I'm like, you know what, Mark, it's okay here. There's really no speed limit. You can speed up. And he's going about 80 kilometers on the Autobahn, and he's flooring it. It won't go any faster. I thought we were going to get rear-ended and die. But anyway, we survived the trip. Obviously, I'm here. But what happened is we went to Nuremberg, and Mark was enjoying seeing all obviously the sites, the post-World War II sites, the Nuremberg trials, buildings, etc. We went to see March Field, where Hitler used to have his big rallies. That's in Nuremberg. So we did a lot of amazing stuff. Then we went to Munich, and then finally we crossed the border into Austria, and there we are. There we are in Austria. This was in Salzburg, and kind of something to do with the story, but here we are, you know, we're traveling together, we're young, in love. And big smiles, the waitress took the picture, and this was pretty much the last time we smiled on this trip. Because the next day, we crossed the border into Poland, which was a really emotional experience for Mark anyway, coming from the background that he did, and this was the first place we stopped. This is the famous railway siding into Auschwitz II, otherwise known as Birkenau. And it was profound. It was, I mean, you see it on TV and it's horrible and it's ugly. When you see it in person, it sears your soul. It was actually probably one of the very few times in our marriage that I ever saw Mark cry. He cried in Auschwitz. He cried because it was a horrible place. It was a place of torture and death. And also, by this time, he talked to his mother at length, and we knew that she and her mother had passed through these gates. Both survived it, but his mother's little sister also passed through these gates and did not survive it. She was gassed. So this was a pretty tough place for us to land. And after we left Auschwitz, we went on to Krakow, which was Mark's mother's hometown. And Krakow's beautiful. It's a really beautiful city. We really enjoyed it there. It was a lot of fun. But we were both kind of emotionally shattered from this and the fact that we had this car that barely could achieve propulsion. So we decided to hire a driver to get us from Krakow to Krosno. The roads were really bad in Poland at this point, and the signposting was almost non-existent. And we weren't sure we were going to find this place on our own. So we went down to the concierge and asked for a driver, and they had us somebody the next morning who took us to Krosno. And it was probably about an hour drive, and Mark, I'm sitting in the back seat, Mark and the driver in the front seat, and the driver spoke really decent English, and so Mark told him the whole story of his family, and he was interested, presumably he was getting paid. So we get to Krosno, and Mark says, "Where do you think we should start?" And he's like, "Well, why don't you go to City Hall?" And I think, "Oh, City Hall, it seems to me we sent letters there." So he pulls in and lets us out. And I was kind of hoping he was going to come with us to translate, because obviously his Polish was native and his English was decent. So I thought, he could be a lot of help to us. He stayed with the car. And I didn't ask too much about it at that point. I just thought, okay, maybe he's going to guard the car. It's going to get stolen or something. So we go in, and Mark, in his halting Polish, which was pretty much non-existent, he's trying to explain, he's trying to get records and find things out about his family, and a very somber-looking woman across the kiosk is looking at him, steely-eyed, and then shaking her head no, and then she reaches up and pulls down the close sign. And we're like, ooh, not doing well here. So there was another office in the City Hall. It was the Vital Records Department. We went down there, and we're pretty much met with the same kind of reception. Rejection. Yeah, that's better. It was rejection, not reception. And it was plainly obvious, and I'm feeling terrible because I'm the one that said to him, "We're going to go and look around. They're going to give us information." Like I said, the naivety of youth. So we went to a couple of other places and were met with the same thing. So then we go back to the car, and I'm like, "Mishkal." By the way, the driver's name was Mishkal. I'm like, "Mishkal, how come you're not coming in with us to translate?" And he's like, "I don't want to get into this. I don't want to be in the middle of this." And I'm like, "Well, you brought us here. You're in the middle of it." So the story as it stands is, he started explaining. He said, "Number one, we've just come out of Soviet occupation. We learned not to be real helpful. Nobody really is going to want to do anything for you. And the second thing, we don't see a lot of tourists, especially in a small town like this." He said, "The only thing we see coming through here are Jews from North America, and we don't believe that they're coming for genealogy information. We believe they're coming to get property records so that they can reclaim their families' homes." And I'm like, "Oh, great." And he said, "Yeah, it's probably going to be like this for you throughout Poland." I'm like, "Oh, maybe you should have told us this on the way." I'm like, "Okay, well, we're here. What do you suggest we do now?" And he said, "Well, why don't we go to the cemetery?" He said, and here's the cemetery. "Why don't we go to the cemetery and see if you can find any headstones with the Biederman name on it?" And on a bigger screen, you could see more clearly, but the cemetery's a mess. I mean, the weeds were like 3 feet high. It was so overgrown. All of the headstones were kind of toppled. I'm like, we're going to find a name on these beaten up, awful-looking headstones? I don't think so. So I was like, okay, all right, this is a mess. Let's just leave. So it was a really quiet drive back to Krakow. Because I'm like, okay. I felt really bad, obviously, because this was my idea, and we've come away with nothing. So we get back to Krakow. Mishko goes on his way, and it's like, well, where do we go from here? So we get in our lovely Trabant, and we headed back into Germany. We went to Berlin. And there actually was a point in going to Berlin. First off, the wall was still partially up, and we just wanted to see what it looked like. And secondly, we wanted to go to the Wannsee Conference House. I don't know if everybody's familiar with this, but the Wannsee House was where the conference was held by the Nazi hierarchy, that's where they planned the final solution. So this is a house with some really unpleasant history. Beautiful area in suburban Berlin, gorgeous grounds, lovely house, lake out back, and it had the ugliness of the planning of the Holocaust in its history. But, in their wisdom, when the war was over, what did they do with it? They turned it into a museum, and it also had pretty much every archive you could want on Holocaust survivors. So we spent a couple of days at the Wannsee House going through and looking for records. We found significant amounts on Mark's mother's family, which we already knew a fair amount about. Found nothing on his dad's family. And we were trying to figure out why are we not finding stuff? Like, what is it? Like, why are we being stymied? But anyway, it was what it was. We found out info on Mark's mom's family, headed back to Frankfurt, turned in our lovely vehicle, got in the flight home, came home. Went back about our lives. I was doing my little teaching thing. Mark was doing his veterinary work. And every so often we talk about it and say, gee, what are we doing with this? Where are we going with it? And then a couple of things happened pretty much in tandem that changed everything. Number one was access to the internet. Yeah, changed so much. And even though we didn't find anything specific on Mark's dad's family, just having access to the internet to do research was such a boon. So here we were, we had AOL, $19.95 a month, unlimited dial-up, AOL. Anybody remember that? Yeah, so that became Mark's new hobby. I'm going on the internet, and hopefully I can maintain a connection long enough to do something with it. And the other thing that happened that was absolutely incredibly important to our research. One of Mark's horse clients, a man named Jack Darling, who's a really big standardbred trainer, he was recently inducted into the Standardbred Hall of Fame. He and Mark used to sit around and talk about World War II. He was also World War II buff. Not Jewish, but, interested in this stuff, so they talk a lot. And one day, Jack Darling's sitting in front of his TV, and he's watching a documentary on the making of the movie Schindler's List. Talked about how difficult it was to do the staging, to make sure that there weren't any antennae on the building so that it would give the, era of the buildings away, and what they went through to try to make it very realistic as 1940s Europe. And then they panned across the first page of Schindler's List. And Schindler's List was many pages with 1,200 names on it. So they panned across this first page, and Jack's looking at it, and he says, geez, name Biederman. My vet's name's Biederman. I wonder if his dad's a Schindler's List survivor. He already knew he was a Holocaust survivor, so he calls up Mark and he says, I was just watching this documentary, and I know your parents are both Holocaust survivors, but is there any chance that your dad was on Schindler's List? And Mark said, well, I don't know. He never said. But he never said anything, so that was not a particularly unusual thing. So, hey, what's Mark got? By internet. The boon for research. So he goes online and he's looking for copies of Schindler's List. And what does he find? Schindler's List. And right here, number 3 on the list, Biederman, Hirsch, 7/9/25, 7th of September, 1925, Mark's dad's birth date. So he's like, my God, my dad was on Schindler's List. And that was huge for a number of reasons. First off, his dad's part of history. How cool is that? Dad's on Schindler's List. Wow. The other thing why it was really significant is the fact that we're talking mid-1990s, 1,200 people. Many of these folks are still alive. He's got to find them and say, hey, what do you know about my dad? So Again, the internet becomes this absolutely crucial tool. He goes online, finds Schindler's List survivors' chat sites, and posts a request and says, did anybody know HaShoah Biederman from Schindler's List, who was from Krosno, Poland? And miracle of miracles, within a few days, he gets a chat back from this man, Alexander Bialowicz White. The White was addition after he moved to the U.S. He became a urologist, and I guess he figured, keep his name simple, so he became Dr. White. And Dr. White, living in Phoenix, sends Mark a message and says, yes, I knew HaShoah Biederman. So Mark's like, cool. So picks up the phone and calls him up and says, hi, this is Mark. I'm, trying to get information about my dad. What do you know? And he said, well, he and I were bunkmates. When we were at Schindler's Enamel Works factory in Krakow, we were bunkmates. We used to sit up all night and talk about our lives and how much we missed our families and our hometowns and how terrible all this was, but they kind of took care of each other. But then Alex said something else. He says, but the HaShoah Biederman I knew wasn't from Krosno. He was from Lodz. And Mark's like, well, that can't be my dad then, because one of the only things that my mom absolutely knew with certainty was that my dad was from Krosno. And he's like, nope. The HaShoah Biederman I knew was from Lodz, Poland. And Mark's like, oh, well, how do I know? And he said, well, do you have a picture? So Mark came up with the oldest picture he had of his dad, which was his passport picture that he used to come to the United States. And he sent this to Alex White and said, this is my dad. And Alex replied to him, he said, Mark, that was my bunkmate. That was my HaShoah Biederman. Your dad was my HaShoah. He was from Lodz. He said, we used to talk extensively, and he knew Lodz inside and out. He was from Lodz. I'm like, okay. So Mark goes to his mother and says, Mom, Dad was from Lodz. And she said, no, he wasn't. Jewish mother, no, he was not. He was from Krosno. And Mark said, well, can you just maybe humor me? And here, back to the map of Poland, and here's the difference. Okay, here's Krosno down here. Here's Lodz in the middle of the country. And Poland's big. I mean, this isn't like, it's not like they were side by side. I mean, this is half a country away. And it's like, how could this be? So Mark presses his mom into service, and it could actually be a bonus that him being from Lodz, because Lodz was actually the second largest city in Poland. A lot of survivors from Poland. They had one of the biggest ghettos in Poland was in Lodz. So this was a positive thing, because there were, potentially tons of people that were around that actually might have known his dad. So I was like, okay, this could be good, and we kind of have to shift gears. We wasted a lot of time trying to find stuff in Krosno where there wasn't any. However, this could be good. So he presses his mother into service once again and says, Mom, you're connected in the survivor community. Please ask around. Ask the people from Lodz if they knew Dad. Maybe they did. She's like, okay, I will. I think you're wrong, but I will. And of course, nobody in the Detroit area from Lodz knew HaShoah. Then, in March of 2001, Sally had enough of Detroit winters, and she decided to go spend a month in Florida. And she had a lot of friends down in Florida, so she figured she'd just go from house to house to house and, do the circuit and visit, which she did from time to time. And one afternoon, she was in Boca Raton. She decided to get a deli lunch. Went up to the counter, ordered her pastrami, got her drink on a tray. She turns around to get a seat, and she sees somebody sitting at a table, and he's reading a Ledger newsletter. There were so many survivors that made it to the United States from the Lodz ghetto that they used to publish a quarterly newsletter. And he's sitting there reading it. And she's like, oh, opportunity to talk with a landsman. So she goes up, she says, oh, hi, you're from Lodz? He said, yeah. She said, do you mind if I sit? So she sat with him. They start talking, and she raises the question, hey, you know, my son's got this idea that his dad's from Lodz, but I don't really think so. Did you know Herr Biederman? And he looked up from his meal and he said, yeah, I knew him. I mean, talk about serendipity. You know, she happens at that moment to be in Boca Raton in a deli, and this man knows him. So she's like, oh, okay, well, my son would like to talk to you. And he's okay. So he gets a piece of paper, writes his name, Izzy Olivek, writes his phone number, gives it to her and says, give this to your son when you get home. Okay. So she gets home, and she's kind of nonchalant about it. She says, oh, this guy, he thinks he knows your dad. And he's like, how long have you had this? Maybe you should have called me to tell me. You know, I've been looking for information for years. So anyway, Mark puts, punches in the number and says, hi, Izzy, this is Mark Biederman. My mom gave me your name and number. Says you knew my dad. Yeah. And Mark said that he was older and his health was bad, and he was kind of wheezing and kind of coughing in the phone. He wasn't really feeling good. And Mark's trying to draw him out, and as we know, Holocaust survivors don't like to talk anyway. And he wasn't doing well with trying to get information. So finally, in exasperation, he said, you wouldn't happen to have an address for him, would ya? And Izzy said, yeah, he lived at Zaglarska 7. I mean, and Mark was like astounded, like, you have an address? She said, I was joking. And he said, yeah. And Mark said, how did you remember my dad's address all these years? He said, we were next door neighbors. I lived next door at 9. I mean, what an incredible serendipitous event that he knew this address. And then Mark, in his wisdom, didn't sit there and try to pull more information out of Izzy, like, geez, did you ask about the girls, how the family lived, what their lives were like? No, he says, I got the address. I said, okay, thanks, Izzy. And he hung up and said goodbye. So I come home from work, and Mark looks at me and says, hey, guess where we're going? I'm like, Hawaii? No, we're going back to Poland. I'm like, oh, geez, do we have to? He's like, I got an address. I got an address. Do you know how long I've waited for this address? I know where my dad grew up. I got to see the house. And I need to see if these coins are still there. So what do? Packed our bags. Off to Poland. Same kind of thing. Landed. Things were a little better. We got a better car this time. We actually got a car that worked. And we're off from Frankfurt, and this time we went to Lodz. Lodz is a gritty, dirty, broken down industrial town, and it's unpleasant. As soon as we kind of crossed into the town, we're driving, and I'm looking around, I'm like, oh, this doesn't look good. There was anti-Semitic graffiti everywhere. And I was miserably uncomfortable. I'm like, can we just turn around and get out of here? I mean, this is a horrible place. And yeah, I was nervous. I couldn't even imagine how we were going to cope in a place like this. And probably maybe a little over a year ago, I was doing a talk at a California library, and a Polish woman came up to me after, and she said, are you sure it was really that bad? Maybe you're just, it was a lot of years ago, maybe you're just remembering it more harshly than it was. And I thought, you know what, I don't know, I have the internet now, and it's not even dial-up anymore, so I'm going to look up and I'm going to do some research. And one of the things I found that I actually printed out was, I found an academic paper that a woman named Helene Sinrich had done as part of her PhD dissertation. She was a history student, and the title of this portion of her thesis was Reading the Writing on the Wall, a Textual Analysis of Ludge Graffiti. So I'm like, gee, I guess I wasn't the only one to have noticed this. And the first paragraph says, one of the most prominent features of Ludge, the second largest metropolitan area in Poland, with a population just short of 1 million people, is the mass of anti-Semitic graffiti. Swastikas, Jewish stars, anti-Jewish slogans cover the walls of buildings and other structures throughout the city. It was everywhere. They're on walls and entrance halls and, public property, private property, and the extensive anti-Semitic graffiti stretches into surrounding villages and communities for miles around. Yeah, welcome to Ludge. I wanted to leave, but Mark said, look we have been on this quest for so long. It's just been so long. How are we just going to leave here? It's just, something that we just can't do. We're here, and I've got to see where my dad lived. There's been a war. There's been a Soviet takeover. There's been, it could have been urban renewal. The house may not even exist. I have to go and look. So finally, Mark talked me off the ledge, and I left the hotel, and we went to try and find the neighborhood. And here it is. This is Zaglarska Street. Cobblestones, really old buildings, so it's like, okay, didn't get destroyed in the war, and it looks like we have not had any significant urban renewal. Okay, so we keep walking up the street, and what do we find? Zaglarska 7, the Biederman house. And we figured it must have looked a lot better in 1939 because this place is rough. And then here's pulled back. Here's 7, the Biederman house. Here's the Olivec house number 9 that Izzy lived in. So, they were attached. And there's the yard. Ooh, are there coins there? So anyway, we found the house. It's still standing. It looks reasonably intact. The yard looks untouched. Okay, where do we go from here? And I'm thinking, okay, from the graffiti that we saw on the way in, I don't think we're going to be highly well received if we knock on the door and say, hi, my dad used to live here. He was deported by the Nazis. Can we look around? I just didn't think that was going to work. And so this is the reconnaissance trip. We find the house, we find the yard. It's like, okay, we're good. Where do we go from here? So, same thing. We go back to Frankfurt, fly home, and try and figure it out. So Mark starts doing his research, and he says, well, I can't get a metal detector from, Radio Shack because they only go down a few inches. And he said, you know what, if these coins are still there after this many years, they've got to be buried deeper than a few inches. So he was pondering, okay, what do we do? How do we figure this out? And it's like, well, keep working on it. The technology's got to be there. So one evening, he's watching a documentary on, of course, World War II. And there was a section of the documentary where they were talking to an Israeli journalist named Yaron Sforey. Yaron Sforey kind of made his name tracking down plundered Nazi treasures. And the interviewer was saying, so Yaron, how do you find these things when they're buried so deep in the ground? Ground penetrating radar. It's a thing that kind of looks like a hand-pushing lawnmower, and it's square, and it penetrates down several feet. So Mark's like, that's it. I need a ground-penetrating radar. Anyone know where to get those? But Yaron Sforey had one. So Mark had Mark had family in Israel. He called up his cousin and said, do you know Yaron Sforey? And he said, yeah, he's a bit of a schnorrer, but I know him. Anyway, so 3 days later, Mark gets a phone call from Yaron Sforey. And he says, hey, I hear you want to talk to me. He's like, yeah, actually I do. I wanna know if, and he told him the story. He says, I want to know if I could get you to go there with your ground-penetrating radar and look for my family's coins. And Yaron says, it's an interesting story. I'm going to be in New York in August. I'm meeting with Pierre Kafka, who at that time was the head of Fox News in New York. He says, why don't you come out there and we'll kind of pitch it to Pierre and see if we can get Fox News to maybe throw some resources at this. So we're like, great, this sounds fabulous, let's go. So off we go to New York. And this is August of 2002. We go to New York, go to the Fox News building, get our visitor badges, go upstairs, meet Yaron, meet Pierre Kafka. Mark's pitching this to Pierre. And I'm thinking, okay, he's doing great. This is good. I'm trying to read the room, and everything looks great. And then Pierre looks up at him and says, so, this all sounds like Bubba Moss to me. And no children in the room, is there? So, bullshit, really. In Yiddish, it's bullshit. So, it's like, okay. He said, yeah, we're not really interested in pursuing this. Thanks so much for coming out. You'll be leaving now. And off we went. And it was a really long ride down in that elevator back to the ground floor. And then we get off and we're walking out to the street, and Yaron took the next elevator down. He's chasing us down the street, and he's like, hang on, don't lose hope, don't lose faith. I got some other ideas. Okay, schnorrer. Anyway, so here we are. Okay. And so between August of 2002 through the fall, through the winter, Mark would occasionally hear, and Yaron would come up with some harebrained scheme like we should buy the house and bring an excavator in and just start digging, or do some other stuff. It's just, everything was a little bit crazy. Read the book, right? The book talks about in depth what kind of ideas he came up with. And none of them were really feasible. So time goes on, and we're like, okay, we're stymied again. Like, where do we go with this? And then on April 21st, 2003, we're into spring. And Mark gets a phone call from Yaron. And it's like, hi, Mark, it's Yaron. I'm here in Lodge with the Fox News crew, and we've just dug up your family's coins. Here it is, Windsor Star. Let's see, what's the date on this? Yeah, this hit the papers April 24th. This is Windsor Star. Son finds Holocaust survivors' treasure. Not exactly son finds. It was son gets told of find,
But that's not a good headline.
I know, it's not a good headline. But anyway, so here it is. So there we are. Son finds Holocaust treasure. So Yaron's like, and I was really mad because I felt like Yaron usurped him. He should have called him and said, hey, we're going to the house, we're going to dig up and see if we can find coins. I mean, he should have at least have given him the option to be there, but he didn't. And when Mark called him on it, he just said, well, we weren't really here to look for the coins. We came because it was the 60th anniversary of the liberation of the Lodz ghetto. And we were having commemorations. We were meeting with the dignitaries. And we just pitched it to them like, hey, we got this guy back in North America that says his family lived in this house and buried coins. What do you think about us digging around? And they were like, go ahead, dig to your heart's content. But I mean, that story kind of rings hollow to me because, okay, if they were just in town for the commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the Lodz ghetto, what are they doing with a ground-penetrating radar machine? And they did bring it. And They dug up. There were 5 different holes that they dug. The 5th one was the charm. They dug down a little deeper than 3 feet. There was a white ceramic teapot with 63 gold and silver coins from the 17 and 1800s in that pot. Yeah, big deal. Really. So Yaron's trying to brush him off, and then he says, hang on, somebody wants to talk to you. And he hands the phone off to a woman named Joanna Podolska, who was a journalist with the Lodge Gazette. And she's like, Mark, this is big news. It's going across Europe. Everybody thinks this is amazing. We just don't find stuff like this buried underground. She said, are you going to come to Lodge to, see your coins? And he said, yeah, I'll be on the next plane. So off he went, and Joanna was a wonderful hostess. She and her photography crew followed him around for 3 days. This time, actually, Mark was able to fly into Warsaw directly and then take a train to Lodz. So things had improved in Poland. So Joanna and her crew met him at the train station, took him to the house to show him where the coins were found, which hall. She took him to the museum where the coins were being held. She did this great article, and here's Mark looking at the coins in a museum. And you're going to say, did they release the coins to him? It's Poland. Do you even have to ask? They did not. The coins are still sitting in the Museum of Archaeology and Ethnography in Lodz, Poland. And Joanna was very disappointed. Mark took it in stride. He was much less disappointed because ultimately he felt as if,
Switch out your battery.
oh, am I dead? It does this? Okay.
Right. And you're emotionally pointing at home.
Yes, I'm about to cry.
And I don't want to miss it, so here you go.
Okay, thank you. Okay, is this better? Okay. So anyway, Joanna feels bad. Mark takes it in stride because he was very fatalistic anyway. He always felt like, well, I didn't have them anyway, and I don't have them now. It was very important to him, though, that these were found at all, because it was almost like, okay, the one thing my dad told me about his life during the war actually came to fruition. He told me about these coins, and they've been found. It wasn't just some fable or some fantasy. They were there. They existed. These were tangible evidence of what had happened, that they'd been buried and the family had been deported. So Joanna puts Mark on the train and says, I feel bad about how it went down. And she said, is there anything I can do for you? And he said, yeah, actually there is. He said, I have always wanted to know the information about my dad's sisters. Can you potentially get some information about the girls? You speak Polish fluently. You're a journalist. We finally have the right town. Go for it. See what you can find. And Joanna, true to her word, 6 weeks later, these arrive in the mail. And I wish you could see them better, but this is the marriage certificate for Mark's paternal grandparents. And these are the birth certificates for the 3 girls. He now has their names. This is Pesha, Sipra, and Sarah. He's got names. So here he was. This actually was more important to Mark than being in possession of the coins. The fact that he knew these girls' names, and once he knew their names, he could actually use the information, and he was able to go back and research and found out what happened to them. How's our time frame? Do we have time? Okay. Nobody's leaving yet? Okay, so allow me to just read a passage from the book. Just something I like to do to kind of give the girls a voice, because these were young women that really never had a chance to live their lives in totality. So anyway, he gets the birth certificates. My father's oldest sister was named Zipporah. She was born January 28, 1913 in Lodz. At the age of 29, on August 10th, 1942, she was killed by a gunshot to the head from a German military-issued carbine rifle and buried in a mass grave along with her mother and sister in the old Jewish cemetery in Krosno. Okay, so that cemetery I showed you a picture of earlier, that we had no idea that it had anything to do with the family. Several of the family members are just buried there in a pit. Zipporah was one of them. The next eldest Biederman sister was named Pasha. She was born May 18, 1914, also in Lodz, and also on August 10th, 1942, at the age of 28, she was killed by a rifle shot to the head, buried with her mother and sister in that same mass grave in the Jewish cemetery in Krosno. My father's youngest sister was named Sarah. She was born in Lodz, March 3rd, 1920. On August 10th, 1942, she was taken by rail from Krosno to the extermination camp in Belzec. At the age of 22, she was killed, along with her father, by asphyxiation of diesel exhaust while locked in an airtight chamber with hundreds of other Jews. Her remains were incinerated and buried in former farmland around the camp perimeter. So, painful as the memory was, as really horrible as the girl's end was, at least he now knew. He had their names, he had their birth dates, and he was able to find out the date for their yard sites. So really, 20 years of research, and he came full circle. The coins had been found. The girls' identities had been discovered. And that brings us to our conclusion. So, I'd love to take questions. Can I take questions?
In the house was it occupied?
Yes, there were people living in it. You want that?
Well, for the question, otherwise,
The occupancy of the house. Yeah.
The house was occupied, and a lot of people ask me, how did the city officials give permission? The house had been nationalized. The municipal government, it was like municipal housing, so they could give permission to dig. And they also owned the land, so that's why they said, well, the coins are ours. They're found in our land. I'm like, okay, well, that's what you want. Okay, any other questions? Okay. You're going to be my brother, Stuart?
yes.
Thank you so much, Randy, for coming to us and sharing this story. I vaguely remember a little bit about it in the paper, and I didn't realize that Mark had passed away and very young. Is it too personal to ask what happened?
Yeah, you know what? Okay, I'm going to cry. Mark's death was a suicide. Yeah, Mark's death was suicide. Yeah, me too. I always knew he had a lot of angst. He was the child of 2 Holocaust survivors. He had generational damage to his psyche. He grew up in a really traumatized home. And how he managed to keep his demons at bay is he was always super active. And I think the people that knew him here would say Mark was like, yeah, the hockey. Mark played hockey every chance he got. It was like hockey, gym, this, that. I mean, he was busy. I mean, if he was awake, he was in motion. He was zip, 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 zip. And I was like, geez, Mark, do you ever settle down? And he's like, nope, active, busy, keep healthy, busy, active. And Then COVID hit. And everything, all of his coping mechanisms just shut down. There was nothing he could do. So he'd sit in the house and he just started circling the drain. And he was getting deeper and deeper into really bad depression, and there really wasn't much anyone could do. When we were in California, one of my neighbors 5 doors down was a psychiatrist, and I would go and see him, and I'd say, Magdi. His name was Magdi. He was Coptic Christian from Egypt. I'd say, Magdi, I need help. And he'd say, okay, I'm going to go talk to him. And he'd go over and he'd try and draw Mark out and engage him in conversation. And he's like, I'm not going to talk. I don't really want to talk to you. And then after Magdi left, he's like, did you bring him here? I'm like, no, he just wanted to talk to you. But yeah, I brought him there. I mean, it was a really dark time, and I tried to really keep him positive, which was pretty much impossible. And then one day I came home, and he opted to end his life. And I walked into that, which is pretty awful. But I'm not crying. Not yet. I'll go home and cry. Right. Okay,
Right.
Stuart.
I have a feeling that there's nothing that can come after that conclusion.
Well, if anybody else has any other questions, I mean, I'm here, I'm still standing,
Right.
Is Shmuley still alive?
Yes! Shmuley's the dog. You're like, who's Shmuley? Shmuley's,
Shmuley Jack Russell I ever liked.
Oh yeah, Shmuley is 16 years old, and he's still alive. And Shmuley was my empty nest dog. We were still living in Windsor when I got Shmuley. And what happened was my daughter moved out west, and I was empty nesting like crazy. I'm like, oh, Mark, I'm so sad. And he's like, don't worry, I'll get you a dog. Dog's better than a kid. So he got me this little dog, and the amazing thing about it is the dog is Mark. The dog has Mark's personality. In fact, after Mark retired and we closed the clinic and moved to California, one of his techs moved to Calgary to go to nursing school, and she's still out there. And she came and spent a few days with me this past autumn. And she was looking at Shmuley, and she says, God, this you can tell Mark picked this dog. It's just, the dog version of Mark, So, I take really good care of him. He's 16, and I hope he lives forever because, he's like my memory of Mark. Okay. Oh, I think we have another question.
It's not exactly a question. When I was in Warsaw, before I went, I wanted to find out where your husband lived. And I was given an address, and I went to see the address when I was there. And it was new housing on, 4 or 6 houses in townhouses.
So Zaglarska 7 is gone?
I guess so, yes.
Okay.
And it was clear they're built after the war. I mean, they're newer buildings.
Well, they must have been built in the last,
And small lots, too.
they must have been built in the last few years. Because he was there the last time he went back, they did Global TV did a documentary with him back in, I think it was about 2004. And the houses were still there. So these places were built in the last 20 years. Yeah, okay.
Okay. Enormous thanks for coming here, coming back to Windsor. And we have coffee and dessert in the chapel room, so we can continue talking among ourselves and talking with Randy, and it's been a real privilege for all of us. So thanks, Randy.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm honored to have had the opportunity to speak here.
Right.
Thank you,
Thank you. Okay, folks, coffee. That's the least that we deserve.